Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again on my YouTube channel. This is Workshop Quick Takes. In the previous two episodes, we looked at wiring techniques, how to create OEM equivalent, safe, effective wiring for your 4x4 Oxlite and other accessory projects. And these techniques can also be applied effectively to DIY car audio if you happen to be into that. Today, in Don't Call It Part 3, call it an addendum because nobody watches a Part 3, we're going to look at a few things that got left on the cutting room floor in the previous two episodes. One of them was splicing. We touched on it briefly in Part 2 in particular, but didn't really talk much more about it. So let's look into that a little bit more because it is important. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Second, pin crimping. We looked at a couple examples of good solid pin crimps, but didn't talk about why they were good. You need to know that to make sure that you're not looking at a bad one. Third, wire colors. A lot of people, when they get into just small projects, they may only buy 3 or 4 spools of wire, but suddenly you find yourself needing 5 or 6 conductors. Fourth, additional sleeving options. We really didn't touch on fire sleeving, which is a great option when you're going around hot areas, and sometimes you can creatively use it to substitute for other applications. In particular, one of the most popular videos on this channel is where we fix the wiring boot on our 2000 XJ in an unconventional way. And then 5, tools. If you're just getting started in this and you don't have a tool collection yet, you are going to have to buy some, and you might have to spend maybe say $100, and you're like, well, if I'm going to spend that kind of money to get started, what should I get? What should I avoid? Hopefully this will serve as a good wrap up for parts 1 and part 2 so that you can get out there and start doing effective wiring in your vehicle. Okay, so first up, let's talk splices. Automotive splices should be weather sealed, and there are several options. We've even used the cheapies from Harbor Freight, but it's fair to report that pricier units from local hardware and home improvement stores do have a better quality sleeve material in our experience. There's also a solder and a sleeve variety available now, and you can both solder and shrink the sleeve using a heat gun. However, there is a good reason that OEMs prefer mechanical compressions. In applications where harnesses can see motion and vibration, solder can be subject to metal fatigue and fracturing. That said, we've done custom solder splicing a few times when it was unavoidable, made the section as secure as possible, and then crossed our fingers. Okay, to understand a little bit more of the how and why of when to splice and when not to splice, let's look at a classic example of an OEM doing it wrong. This here is the well-known driver's door harness from the 97 to 2001 Jeep Cherokee XJ, quite a bit going through there. This one here, unfortunately, has had the little weather sealing boot broken off that normally goes right inside the cabin. But of course, if you have one of these, then you know the door pass-through goes through here, and then it goes inside the main door, and then this whole section right here curves up and around the way it's normally mounted in the door. So as this thing stretches in and out, going through when the door opens and closes, it's supposed to walk like this. However, that is not exactly the most fantastic idea ever, and to see why, let's look at how it's constructed in here to figure out if there's anything that could go wrong. This particular loom has only 130,000 miles, and already it has a classic XJ problem. Here's an example of a factory splice placed in an area where the loom moves. And actually, it's not one factory splice, it's 2. See this one here that already fell out? This is a problem. What is the result of that? Broken grounds. And you know, all of this is just due to poor wiring practices by Jeep. There's another one breaking, another one breaking. But this splice right here, if you have to make a splice, please don't make a splice in a location like this, because that's why these break first. There's this large hard piece of plastic right here, and then it has to flex at the ends when anything shifts around, and eventually that just destroys it. If you do have to make a splice, always put it somewhere where it's just going to be sitting still in a sheath. It's not going to be expanding or contracting, moving around, whatever. So that being said, let's take a quick look at how to make a good one. In general, you should avoid them when you're running new wire as much as possible. Run wire point to point, and if you need to make connections, do it at weather sealed pinned connectors. But sometimes it's unavoidable. You know, you run out of wire and you just have to get across, or you're trying to repair a break in a factory wire. So then going to the wire we're splicing into, same thing. Okay, that one's in tight. And shrink with a heat gun preferably. You can use a butane torch or something if you have to, just be careful not to set it on fire, but the heat gun is best. As the tube shrinks, the applied heat also melts an adhesive sealant which flows around the wire insulation. This process is visible during the heating and gives a good indication that the splice is fully shrunk and water sealed. The tube then returns to a translucent state as it cools. The newly formed seal can also be seen by looking down the end of the completed splice. That's the splice. Now the next question is, what are you going to do when you have two splices side by side? In this case, we've got extra white wire on this side, none on this side. If we make a whole bunch of splices, and you know, two side by side might not be such a big deal, but what if you have 3 or 4 or more? So you want to offset them in some kind of sensible pattern. And when you offset them, you also want to think about, well, am I wrapping around a corner on this? Because if I have one right after the other in kind of a chain of ants, they're going to put tension on each other when you actually wrap them around that bend. Let's just think about this and say, let's go this far over this way. And then on this wire here, we're going to offset slightly because, again, we have the length of the splice in the way, but not all of it. And so let's just offset slightly and cut there. And there we go. And then let's just try and unwind this a little bit so that we can get the heat gun on here without melting the wires. But now look what we've done. We've offset the splices just enough that they don't interfere with each other. And if we had to do a third one, we could come back up here, we could go farther down here. We could decide that alternates of 2 are enough in order to get through, but we've avoided making the loom unnecessarily thick by just stacking them side by side. And then one thing you might want to do to protect this area right here from damage, because again, you don't want these catching on things when you're pulling them through or whatever, is you might want to go ahead and continue wrapping the loom like we were doing up here. You might want to take some notes as part of the diagrams that you're hopefully making to keep track of what you did in the vehicle, that there are splices in this loom right here, so that if you ever have trouble on this section, you can come back, run a continuity test on it, and make sure one of those hasn't failed silently. Okay, couple quick notes on pins and crimping for connectors. We went on about these for a while last time, even showed some close-ups of what one looked like when it was done sloppily, as well as what one looked like when it was done perfectly on the first try. But didn't really explain why that was. These little connectors right here, the inner ones that are supposed to wrap around the conductor, make sure there are no strands that are popped out of the connector, sticking out randomly. 2 reasons for that. On these connectors, you're fairly safe even if that happens, because with the Delphi connector, they are fully divided all the way from the weather seals forward. So, looking straight down there, no way for a loose strand to cross over and touch the other connector. So this is a very well thought out design. Deutsch is the same thing, but if you look in the back side of the Deutsch connectors where the weather seal goes in, on these, if you had overstripped the cable far enough and had a strand sticking off, it is possible it could actually fold back and short over to the other terminal inside the connector here. Again, not a high probability, but other connector types you use might not be so forgiving. Not all of them are designed as thoroughly and thoughtfully as these. But the other thing that you're then watching out for is ampacity of the conductor. If you get a bad crimp where you have 2 or 3 of those frayed out, you have technically reduced the current carrying capacity at that pin. And, you know, for an application where you've got everything over-designed and over-spec'd, you can probably get away with just trimming off those pieces so that they don't cause any issues. But on high current applications, that actually can be a problem. And then the other thing, of course, is just to make sure that these end pieces have nicely come over and lock themselves into the insulation. If you get the wire overstripped and then have it sticking out too far, and these 2 outer ones also go into the wire, you don't get the proper strain relief action that's intended, because when wires are pulled on or manipulated, there's 2 things going on. One is that the insulation jacket on the outside is stretching and the wire inside is stretching. And these types of pins are designed to lock down both so that you get that strain relief action. Couple quick notes on wiring that hopefully you'll find helpful. It's always nice if you can get yourself a collection of multiple colors like this, but for many people, especially those just doing a one-off small project, that's not practical. When you go to the auto parts store or the home improvement store and buy stranded wire spools off the shelf, well, I mean, a minimum size is usually around 10 or 15 feet for 10 or 15 bucks, and you have to buy a unique reel and color for each one. That gets really pricey. So let's suppose that you only have 3. And let's just say you're starting out with red, black, and white, because why not? Red, of course, is traditionally a fused but often unswitched power supply. It doesn't have to be, but that's a good color to use if you have an application like that. And most blacks in a car application are grounds. Other colors can be whatever they need to be. In this case, let's just assume we have white for a control wire. So, we got 3 colors, but for some reason we need to run 4 wires because we're going to have a power and a ground, and we're going to have 2 control circuits of some kind. Okay, 3 colors, but 4 circuit wires. How are we going to differentiate them? Well, one straightforward way that you can do is just use tape color coding. In automotive applications, quite often you'll find that there's a stripe or a spiral tracer on a lot of wires that differentiates them from other wires of the same color. So you might have black and you might have black with a green tracer on it or something along those lines. That's trickier to replicate, but what you can do is just add little tape striping. Similar to how we were bundling cables using small lengths of tape, you could also color code just a single piece. But if this is going to run any length, you might also want to go at regular intervals, say 12 to 18 inches, and color code it there too. So I just added another stripe in the middle to illustrate that. But now what we have is, we have our red, we have our black, we have white, and we have white with a blue stripe. We can easily distinguish all 4 of these wires using only 3 wire colors. So let's suppose in this bundle we have a second power and ground going to some circuit. So now I've got an issue because I've got 2 reds, 2 blacks, and 2 whites. Now I've differentiated my whites, but how am I going to differentiate my red, black, white, white, blue circuit from my second red, black circuit? Again, you could start color coding wires individually, but another thing I could do is I could bundle these off separately. And again, I could use tape, or I could also use shrink wrap insulation. That also works. And I'm using a nice contrasting color. Apologies to those of you who might be red-green colorblind. This is what I got handy at the moment. So red wire, black wire, in a green sleeve. This will very positively be a separate circuit. With each group of wires clearly identified, we can now start bundling them just like we were showing before and get ready to put split loom or whatever we're going to do to protect them. There's a problem on the workbench here, however, and that is the fact that this reel right here is the only wire of the 11 shown over here that I would trust for automotive work. Why? This is the only one that is in fact stranded copper wire. There's a characteristic ductility to copper. If you look at the sides, it's copper. If you look at the ends, you see copper shining back at you. All 10 of these turn out to be copper-coated aluminum. Aluminum wire does have a characteristic ductility that is much softer than copper. You can just flop the edges over pretty easily. And even though it is copper-coated, if you look at the ends, you see the aluminum shining back at you. Also, rough it up with a little bit of sandpaper, and that copper coating scrapes off, and then you can definitely see the aluminum. Now, there are legitimate applications for aluminum wiring. As it happens, it is lightweight, and while the ampacity is lower, that can be solved by upsizing it. For example, a number 16 copper wire would need to be replaced by a number 14 aluminum, at least. And they are popular for aircraft applications due to being lightweight. However, in aircraft applications, there are very strict regulations about how they are terminated and how they are secured and so forth. For DIY automotive, I wouldn't recommend. Stick with copper wire if at all possible, and make sure when you buy yours, that's what you're getting. Because all of these, I picked up off one of the usual online websites, thought, hey, that was a good price. Didn't realize there's a reason why it was a good price. Okay, let's take a couple quick seconds on fire sleeve. I think fire sleeve itself is actually a trademark and somewhere back up the line, but if you use that as a search term, you'll find plenty of products exactly like these and a few more besides. The ones I like the most are like this, and they come in a variety of different diameters as well as different colors, usually red and black, sometimes others. And what this is, it is a high temperature fiberglass weave surrounded and partially impregnated by a silicone coating that holds it all together and provides some abrasion resistance on the outside as well as additional thermal isolation. The most common application for something like this is around turbos where you have oil feed lines that have to pass hot components. But it can also be used for, say, gas line that's running a little bit too close to a header and you want to make sure that it's safe. It can be used for protecting wiring in situations where you might be worried about temperature sources from the outside. One other application I like for it, however, is if you have a wire that you might want to protect other things from. So for example, I'm still planning to do some battery wiring work on my Jeep, and when I do that, there is a wire that goes straight from the battery down to the starter, nothing else protecting it, and if any kind of short circuit occurs, that thing will fry wide open. If it then touches something else, it can sit there and start a fire. So I'm thinking that when I run a heavier gauge cable down to there, I'm going to route it through this. This here is a hook and loop style, similar to Velcro. You're supposed to wrap it around the component that you're protecting and then secure the Velcro, and that'll hold it together. And again, these are available in different inner diameters also, so you just specify what you want and order it from the vendor of your choice. There's also products like this. This again is the same fiberglass weave inside there, but this time it is protected by an aluminized coating that's supposed to be heat reflective. The aluminized coating out here obviously doesn't have the same durability as the silicone, so this definitely needs to be put in a place where it's not going to chafe or abrade. The silicone itself provides a little bit more protection, but it is not puncture proof, so consider securing it down a little bit more carefully. In any case, these are not the only options. There's other types of woven and coated fiberglass products out there for this purpose. However, when ordering something like this from gray market suppliers like, say, eBay, I never trust it when I get it. Even though it's made of very cheap materials and there's not a lot of incentive to counterfeit it, I still like to take a sample piece, hit it with a torch for a bit, and that will destroy it, but it's not going to just burst into flames. Unsurprisingly, the hook and loop assembly does burn like any other plastic. The fiberglass and silicone part of this assembly sustained severe damage in the 3,600 degree flame, but do not burn away even after 30 to 45 seconds of direct application. They're the real thing. That's all the proof you usually need to make sure that you got something that is legit. So, that is another option available to you if you want to take it. Okay, we talked a bit about tools in part 2, so I don't want to belabor this too long, but you might want to be thinking about a couple things when you are getting ready to do projects like this. Everyone has one of these. It's called a side cutters, and it's exactly what it does, is it cuts on the sides. This, of course, for many people who've just done a little bit of hobby wiring, is known as both a wire cutter and a wire stripper, but it's not particularly good as a wire stripper, and as a wire cutter, if you cut any wire that's particularly thick, it's going to crush and flatten it. Nonetheless, it works pretty well for that for most smaller needs. This here is something that a lot of people have in a toolbox, and this is fine for having in an emergency kit in your car if you're going to need to make a trail side repair. But these, because they have this single hinge point right here, they tend to wear badly over time. And the wire cutter here, the more you use it, the faster this goes. These here are all right, but I mean, you can see if you look at this one up close that already the holes there are getting some wear on the edges and they don't do it as neatly. Nonetheless, if you have no choice, use one of these to do wire stripping so that at least you have a sized strip rather than trying to do it with one of these. There are a couple other options. This is another one, and it works fine if you are willing to loosen this set screw here and actually adjust it towards the wire you're doing. But I suspect if you're like me, you might get lazy and just try and wrap those little points there around the wire and just sort of work at it. Again, same problem as with the side cutters. You can damage the strands. This here is a little better and a little higher quality. This, again, actually does use the round things, but this has a pair of blades that go past each other. So unlike this one where it just has two edges coming together, this one here actually maintains a more reliable cut. There's also an automatic wire stripper you see me use. This is a very cheap one from Harbor Freight. You set the depth gauge right here and then put the wire in, and then it just grabs it and pulls it off. This one here is not quite as nice about not damaging the strands. It can nick them a little bit on the edges, but overall it's a fairly effective tool. There's also a higher quality one available at Harbor Freight, and most other home improvement and hardware stores will have better versions than this one. For occasional use though, it works all right. Of course, if you're going to be cutting any larger wires or stripping any larger wires, you're going to need to get into more specialized tools. And in particular, you may see a cutter that instead of having flat blades like a side cutters, it actually has two curved blades that go past each other. But that's mostly going to be useful if you're getting into like battery cables and big things like that. Terminals. If you're going to be compressing terminals, we talked last time that you really do want some kind of full cycle crimping tool. Now, as it happens, the last time I was at Harbor Freight, I noted they now have their own version of this. The older one that they had was a cheaper design. The one and only time I tried buying that one there, it broke on the first use, go figure. And the other thing we showed you in part 2 was this kit. If you're going to do a number of terminals, you need something serious like this where you have the interchangeable heads for the different styles. So if you've got a bit of money to spend to get started in wiring and you do want to actually have some of the useful tools, little ones like this, depending on the quality, can be anywhere from just a few dollars to 10 or 15. And a kit like this anywhere from 50 to over 100 depending on what kind of quality you want. This is a bit of a lower end one, but it does have the ratchet release on the crimping tool and the interchangeable dies, and since I don't do connectors that often, this is more than enough. The point I want to make is if you're only using it occasionally, you can at least get something that's good enough, and it's better than just trying to pick up one of these and do everything with it. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us again on Workshop Quick Takes. Hopefully you found this Don't Call It Part 3 addendum helpful. And again, this goes with Part 1 and Part 2. If you haven't watched those, you really need to see those to figure out why we were explaining these things today. But now that we've got all that covered, you should be ready to at least take some tentative steps in the water if you haven't already, or if you have taken a few steps, maybe you'll go a little deeper and do your own automotive wiring. Don't need to be afraid of it, just need to be careful and thorough so that it doesn't come back to bite you. Thanks for joining us again today. We'll see you again next time, whenever that is. Has anyone seen my phone?